Hello, and welcome to the 10th lecture and the last one. We are almost finished. Isn't that awesome? Aren't you sad? Semester's almost over. Well, if you haven't had U.S. History 2 yet, you still have that to look forward to. All right, so the Civil War is now over. The question is, how do we reunite America? How do we rebuild the United States of America? How do you reunite a country when a majority of some states fought to leave it? There was a lot of bitterness, and it didn't end overnight. Years ago, I remember A&E had a special on the Civil War on the Gettysburg, which they said that the sides entered as Yankees and Confederates and left as Americans. Whoever said that was one of the stupidest people that ever lived. The bitterness over the Civil War lasted well into the 20th century. Some ways it lasts even till today. Emancipation became a reality in June of 1865. Question now is, how are former slaves going to be treated? And how can the South be brought back into the Union? Many whites, both in the North and the South, wanted to ignore freedom, and few wanted equality altogether. In a lot of cases, African Americans became scapegoats on both sides. People in the North blamed them for the war, so did people in the South. So there's a lot of bitterness, a lot of tension between former slaves and whites. There's also a lot of anger and divisiveness between the North and the South. So how do we fix this? This is quite a problem to fix. A lot of things could have happened. Former Confederates could have been tried for treason and executed. Former slaves could have taken revenge. You couldn't have blamed them if they had. Early on in 1865, only a small group supported black suffrage. Those would be the radical Republicans. Majority of whites in the North and the South did not yet. The radical Republicans wanted African Americans to have the right to vote, but they were in the minority. Some of the strongest of the radical Republicans were Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, who were the harshest voices on how to bring the South back into the Union, and the most pro-equality voices for African Americans. There's Sumner, there's Stevens. Lincoln's plan, as of December of 1863, he'd issued a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, which allowed states to be restored if 10% of the voters took an oath of allegiance to the Union. This minority could then form a new government and elect new people to serve in this government. The only restriction would be former Confederate officials would be barred from serving. Getting 10% of the voters take an oath of allegiance would have been very easy. Every state, there was more than 10% of the residents had supported the Union. Many Republicans saw this as way too lenient. They wanted to punish the South more and do more to guarantee that former slaves would be treated fairly. Would this have been Lincoln's plan at the end of the war? We don't know. He was assassinated, so we don't know what he would have done. You have to look at this as an action taken during the war when his goal was to end the war. So, of course, he's likely to go lighter. He's going to let you off with a less quote-unquote punishment if you voluntarily stand back as opposed to being forced into submission. So we don't know what Lincoln would have done. The task fell to Lincoln's vice president, this man, Andrew Johnson, a native of Tennessee. Like most Tennessee Democrats, his hero was Andrew Jackson. He was born in North Carolina, moved to Tennessee as a young age. He was in some ways similar to Andrew Jackson in that he had a hot temper. He saw himself as the embodiment of the common man. He came from humble origins, came from poverty. He was a bitter critic of secession. He saw himself as the common man, and he disliked and resented the plantation aristocracy, which he saw as being the root of secession. And so thus he was a bitter critic of it, and that's one of the reasons he stuck with the Union. Early on, he made harsh statements about former Confederates. Radicals, Johnson's kind of an outsider, though. He's a Democrat who had served as vice president for a Republican. Radicals saw Johnson as a potential ally. Radical Republicans thought maybe he's similar to Lincoln. Southerners saw him as a traitor. Both of them were wrong. Johnson was a kind of a complicated guy. He was not a friend to either Confederates nor abolitionists, although he opposed slavery and opposed the plantation aristocracy. He was also very racist. He disliked slavery not because he cared about slaves, but because he thought it harmed poor whites. So he didn't really have any natural allies. He was kind of a politically a loner, which makes it even more difficult for him to serve effectively as president. His plan was similar to what Lincoln's had been in 1863. Also, very lenient. Almost all former Confederates who took an oath of allegiance to the Union would be given a pardon, and once they did this, their property, which had been confiscated, would be returned, with the exception of slaves. At this point, new governments could form new governments. The only requirement for these new governments is that they must repudiate secession and ratify the 13th Amendment. Military officers and politicians in the old Confederacy were to be excluded because they mostly came from the aristocracy. His view was this would break the aristocracy. These new governments were formed, and they decided to flip the bird to the north, and they elected a bunch of former Confederate officials to serve in these governments, including the former vice president of the Confederacy himself. These new governments immediately instituted what they called black codes, which put restrictions on freedom for African Americans. African Americans were, in a lot of cases, had to obey curfews. They weren't allowed to congregate in public. They had to work a full year before they could get paid. Things which were sort of workarounds for slavery. African Americans are no longer slaves, but black codes are going as far as they can to still enslave them without actually enslaving them. And so former slaves are no longer free. And a lot of people in the North began to ask, well, the point of the war is to end slavery. If we let the South get away with this, what was the point of the war? So there is a backlash in the North against this. And I should mention the Jim Crow laws will be a precursor. The black codes are going to be a precursor to the Jim Crow laws, which are going to come in a few more years. All right, so Congress, which is comprised mostly of Northerners, does not like this plan at all. Johnson, though, doesn't do himself any favors because he's hot-tempered, not diplomatic, prone to anger. He has a temper. He's not a great politician. So he's not really ready to negotiate or willing to negotiate with the Republicans in Congress. His temper and his vindictiveness turned people off, alienated people who might have agreed with him. He saw the real victims here as being the poor whites of the South who had been victimized by the aristocracy. He didn't really care much about the former slaves. So here's a picture of the Freedmen's Bureau, like a government agent serving to keep the former slaves and the former plantation owners away from each other's throats. I didn't mention this. Freedmen's Bureau was continued by Congress. Its design was to help former slaves in the Confederacy. School teachers, particularly women from the North, came down south and taught school to former slaves. Children and adults taught them to read and write and different skills. Remember that it was illegal to teach a slave to read or write, so many slaves did not have the opportunity before to learn how to do this. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared African Americans to be citizens. Andrew Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto, and this is the first time in American history that a law has been passed over veto. And Johnson's unwillingness and stubbornness here angers many moderate Republicans and even some Democrats. Freedmen's Bureau going to vote. The 14th Amendment was then proposed. This included the Equal Protections Clause, which stated that everyone born in the United States and subject to jurisdiction thereof is a citizen of the United States. It also states that a state cannot deny any citizen the equal protection of the law, thus granting theoretically equality to African Americans. Johnson was opposed to this. Again, calls racism. He then goes on a speaking tour of border states trying to rally opposition to this, but it's ultimately unsuccessful. And the 14th Amendment passes both houses of Congress and then gets ratified by 3/4 of the states and goes into the Constitution. So he loses this battle. All right, so 1867, Congress passes the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which was passed over Johnson's veto again. This invalidated the state governments that had been set up by Johnson and Lincoln, except for Tennessee, which had already been readmitted since it had ratified the 14th Amendment, and instead created 5 military districts in the South, and federal troops are sent in to maintain order in those states and to protect the rights of former slaves. And there's what the districts look like. Voters in these states, which included all black males, as well as white men who had not supported the Confederacy, could then elect constitutional convention, which would then write new constitutions for these states. These new constitutions were required to end slavery, allow African American men the right to vote, and they had to be approved by Congress. So this is harsher than the Reconstruction plan that Johnson had proposed, but all things considered, not really unreasonable. You might know Johnson, if he's remembered today, as being the first of only 2 presidents ever to be impeached. And why did Johnson get impeached? Well, as you can see, his relationship with Congress is not good. They are at each other's throats. Congress saw Johnson as out of control and basically a proto-Confederate. Not really true, but certainly true that Johnson was a racist who stood in the way of rights for African Americans. Congress passed in 1867 the Tenure of Office Act. And what the Tenure of Office Act did was stated when a president assumes the presidency from the position of VP, he cannot fire a cabinet member that was appointed by his predecessor unless the Senate approves it. Johnson never backs down from a challenge. He immediately tests it. He fires Secretary of War Henry Stanton. As a result of this, he has officially broken the law, which, according to the Constitution, a president can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So Congress begins impeachment proceedings against Johnson. The House votes to impeach him. It then goes to the Senate for trial. If 2/3 of senators vote to convict the president, then he's removed from office. If fewer than 2/3 vote to convict, then he is acquitted and remains in office. It takes 2/3 to vote. The final vote was 35-19 in favor of conviction. Is that 2/3? If you're a math major, you probably know the answer is no. It is 1 vote short of 2/3. You can tell what 2/3 is because if the higher number is at least double the lower number. 36-18 would be 2/3. 35-19 is not. So Johnson is impeached, but not removed from office. 7 Republicans voted against impeachment, and he survives. Although his political career at this point is destroyed, and he never really recovers. He does later on run for and is sent back to the Senate later on by Tennessee, where he receives a standing ovation from the Senate that had impeached him, ironically, but he dies shortly thereafter. This is the only impeachment in American history up until 1998 when Bill Clinton was impeached. He also was acquitted. To date, no president, as of March 2019, no president has ever been removed from office via impeachment. So there's the drawing of the proceedings. There's a ticket to the impeachment trial. There's a cartoon of obviously presenting him as a king. 15th Amendment. We got to talk about this. 15th Amendment guaranteed African American men the right to vote. there was a move to include women in this too. So the 15th Amendment would have guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race or gender. Unfortunately, this failed. Um, However, there was some silver lining here. In 1869, Wyoming became the first territory to grant women the right to vote. A year later, in 1870, Utah followed suit. So there are some victories for women's rights now, and these are going to gradually continue for the next 50 years until 1920, when women get the right to vote altogether, or nationwide, I should say. 15th Amendment's passed. In the South now, we have new governments. These are Reconstruction governments. You know, the ideology that slavery was based on, the ideology of white supremacy, doesn't go away overnight. There's a lot of white people and former Confederates in the South who are outraged by the fact that African Americans now have the right to vote and are now running for office. Republicans control the South, but most white Southerners hate Republicans. They see them as the enemy, and now they rule the South. What do these people do? These critics of this do? Many of them resort to vigilantism. They become terrorists, essentially. They attack and intimidate African Americans and their white allies throughout the South. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Only about 10 to 15% of white men in most of these states were enfranchised, as were all black men. As a result of this, African Americans were the majority in 5 states. It looks like the social order from just a few years earlier has been totally turned upside down. The landed aristocracy had once had all the power and oppressed everyone else. Now they have no political power, and the former slaves and the poor whites, to a lesser extent, now do have the power. So, because we have majority African American in some states, the first African Americans run for office and get elected. Hiram Rhodes Revels, I should say, becomes the first African American member of Congress. He's elected from Mississippi in 1870. Carpetbaggers, should mention this, was a term that Southerners used for Northerners who came south after the war. It was a derogatory term. Some came for dishonorable purposes to make a buck. Some were idealists who were coming to try to help former slaves. They established schools for former slaves. They helped slaves find family members who'd been sold away. A scallywag was a term Southern whites used for other Southern whites who became Republicans or supported Reconstruction after the war. One example of someone who was called a scallywag was James Longstreet, who'd been a Confederate general who ended up joining with the Reconstruction and supporting rights for African Americans. Some of these were corrupt. Some wanted to improve the South. Their view was, we lost, we should accept it, move on, try to make things better. Some of them had opposed secession in the first place, or even opposed slavery in the first place. So, diverse group. There's Hiram Rhodes Revels. Republican rule, South Carolina Convention, for example, had a majority African Americans in elected offices. However, it's worth noting that no state instituted land reform. Remember, Sherman's promise of 40 acres and a mule didn't happen. They could have broken up plantation land and redistributed among former slaves. That probably would have been, or that would have definitely been the reasonable thing to do, but it didn't happen. The way we view this has changed a lot in the last 50 to 60 years. If you'd taken this class, say, in 1950, the view of Reconstruction governments were as they were corrupt. That's changed somewhat because that view was largely based on racism. There was some corruption in these new governments, but there's corruption in all governments. Compared to previous governments, there was probably not much of a difference. Nonetheless, this idea that African Americans are now getting something close to equal rights, are now able to serve as senators and representatives, outrages a lot of racist whites. And they view African Americans as inferior. They fear that African American rule is going to bring about equality. There were Democrats in both the North and the South opposed black voting, and vigilante efforts began against black voters. The Ku Klux Klan, you might have heard of, was formed in Pulaski, Tennessee, shortly after the end of the Civil War. The first leader of it was a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest, he of Fort Pillow infamy. He also has his bust is controversially on display at the state capitol in Nashville. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, as he founded it, was not exactly the same as the modern KKK. It was definitely a racist organization that targeted African Americans, but it was also, to some extent, a organization that resisted Union occupation. It was definitely a racist organization, definitely a terrorist organization, though. The enforcement acts were passed by Congress. These were designed to protect African American voters. There's Nathan Bedford Forrest. The Ku Klux Klan, we should mention this. This is a poster for The Birth of a Nation, which was a movie which came out in 1915. The Ku Klux Klan existed for a few years until the 1870s when Forrest actually called for it to be disbanded. His view was it had become too violent. It had always been violent, but I guess it became more violent. And the Klan went away. Didn't come back until 1915 when a movie, Birth of a Nation, was released, which presented the Klan as the heroes of Reconstruction. And people watching this thought, wow, that's cool. They're wearing sheets and hoods and going out and fighting crime. Let's do that. And so the Klan came back in 1915, unfortunately. Like a bad penny, it just keeps turning up again and again. That's the Klan we have today, is a descendant of that Klan. And also the Klan from the 1860s and 1870s, but like I said, that one went away for a while and then came back. Pact of Emancipation, slavery's over, but many African Americans are not equal at all. Imagine, though, you're a former slave. To be freed must be one of the best feelings in the world. Still, it's also probably has to be exhilarating, but also scary to some extent, because what's the future? And especially scary because of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and vigilante groups that will target you if you try to exercise any kind of political power on your own. Over 95% of former slaves were illiterate. Remember, it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write, and often had meager skills. Most of them had worked out in the fields most of their lives. Some former slaves left the plantation as a resort after this, and many former slave owners were shocked when this happened. One former slave owner's wife said, quote, "I have never in my life met with such ingratitude." She said that when slaves she had owned left the plantation. She thought that, I guess, that slaves were supposed to be grateful to her, which I guess sums it up. Many slaves left the countryside for the cities where jobs were. They also went and searched for lost family members. The Freedmen's Bureau was formed to help that. Other slaves stayed on the plantation and became sharecroppers. What's a sharecropper? We'll talk about that in just a minute. African American institutions, though, which had already existed, some of them, a few, began to grow and flourish more. African American churches saw great growth. Ministers in these churches became community leaders because the church was one of the few institutions that African Americans could obtain a leadership role in. Schools were formed for African Americans too, as well as colleges like Howard University or University of Atlanta or Fisk University in Nashville were formed to help former slaves and African Americans. There's a postcard from Howard University. I believe that's Fisk University. African American schools were established, but they were generally underfunded, and it was taken for granted that they would be segregated. Segregation is going to last legally until the 1950s. There's funding. Getting funding for them is difficult. Not many whites were willing to contribute money for African American schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 had ended segregation, except in schools, but the Supreme Court overturned it in 1883, and that's going to be the last civil rights bill passed by Congress until 1957. There's a huge paranoia about intermarriage among whites, and so thinking was segregation has to be the way we go. No 40 acres and a mule. There's no land division. In Georgia in 1876, African Americans only owned about 1.3% of the total acreage. It's almost impossible for African Americans to obtain land. You have to have money to buy land, which most African Americans didn't. Even if you did have the money, obtain the money to buy land, most whites wouldn't sell it to you. So you're completely shut out of land ownership for the most part. The only, again, probably land redistribution would have been the right move here, but it didn't happen. What did happen was sharecropping. And this becomes a huge industry for many years. And in some way, it's a continuation of slavery, although at least it did give some autonomy and freedom to former slaves. Here's how it works. You have plantations, hundreds of acres, maybe thousands of acres, where you grow cotton. You need people to work in those fields. Without slaves, there's a labor shortage. Former slaves need jobs. So what we're going to do is divide the plantation up into plots of land. Each sharecropper is going to be responsible for growing X number of bales of cotton or whatever on their plot of land per year. Any cotton or anything else they grow in excess of that, they get to keep for themselves. That number is what they give to the landowner as rent, essentially. So poor whites also took part in this. It was mostly blacks and some poor whites. And this did provide opportunities for African Americans and poor whites. It was an improvement over slavery, but it's also easy to see how in a lot of ways it's a continuation of slavery. It took advantage of people who had not had any opportunities prior to this. Or I should say have been denied opportunities prior to this. There's how sharecropping worked, percentage of farms that were sharecropped. The darker the red, the higher the percentage. It just almost perfectly matches up with where slavery had been most prominent. There's sharecroppers. All right, so Johnson does not run for re-election in 1868. Ulysses Grant does, and he wins in 1868 and inaugurated in 1869. And Johnson oversees a corrupted, scandal-ridden administration. Although was a great general, his historical reputation has improved considerably in recent years. He was popular throughout the North because he was a war hero. He had some respect in the South as well. He treated Lee pretty respectfully at Appomattox, so some white Southerners respected that, and African Americans supported him. Over time, though, the focus shifts away from Reconstruction and towards the economy. This is especially true after the Panic of 1873, which is a depression, or not a depression, but a major economic downturn that happened. When the economy goes bad, that usually gets most of the attention, and attention shifted away in the North from Reconstruction. Talked about this. Map looked like. Depression struck. Greenback Party was formed in 1876 to keep greenbacks in construction. Money question, though, begins to overshadow Reconstruction, and the North mostly loses interest in Reconstruction and the rights of former slaves in the South. Supreme Court ruled that civilians could not be tried by military courts. This was how those who were accused or charged with harming African Americans were tried. The reason being, a local civilian court would not give them a fair trial, or not treat African Americans fairly, I should say. As you know, during the Jim Crow era, lynchings were common, and those who carried out lynchings or the unlawful murder of usually African Americans usually faced absolutely no consequences at all. In fact, many of them posed for the camera while committing murder because they just knew that no white jury would convict them. The military courts were used to ensure that people who committed crimes like this were punished, but the Supreme Court ruled they couldn't do it anymore. So that puts a big dent in Reconstruction efforts. In the slaughterhouse cases, Supreme Court case of 1873, Louisiana had granted a monopoly to a single slaughterhouse. This was done at least partially to prevent competition from slaughterhouses owned by African Americans. The court ruled this was okay. So again, chipping away at Reconstruction here. Public, as we know, has a short attention span and wants things fixed quickly. And fixing the problem of slavery, which had existed as an institution for in the United States 350 years, probably not going to get fixed in 6 months or 10 years or 150 years. So as other issues come to the forefront, as the economy gets bad, as the courts rule against civil rights, the Republicans begin commitment to Reconstruction begins to decline. And by 1875, radical Republicans had largely faded. Troop numbers began to decrease in the South. Federal troops at what had protected the rights of African Americans. Fewer and fewer of them are present, which means that the white supremacists are able to take more and more power away from African Americans. And as time goes on, more and more whites regain voting rights. They also used intimidation to predict and violence to prevent African Americans from voting. Gradually, the rights of African Americans are being chipped away, and eventually, whites are going to be the only ones voting, and African Americans are going to be almost completely disenfranchised. Ex-Confederates redeeming, as I said, term redeeming is probably not the right word, but it was the word that they used. It was used, what it meant was whites and Democrats retook the South. Scallywags and carpetbaggers either left or were forced out. And we go back to a social order similar to what had existed under slavery. Slavery doesn't come back, but Jim Crow laws do, and African Americans have their rights taken away. And it's going to be a long time before African Americans enjoy political rights again. And this is evidence that history is not simply a gradual march of progress. If you were an African American in Mississippi in 1870, you would have had far more rights than if you were an African American in Mississippi in 1940. During Reconstruction, there were a lot of advances made in terms of civil rights, in terms of rights for African Americans. Those rights were overwhelmingly taken away by the 1880s and didn't get restored again until the 1950s and 1960s. So things don't automatically get better. They only get better if we make them better. The New South became the new buzzword of the region. What this meant was leaders of the South wanted to shift away from an agrarian society towards more industry, and Southern leaders began recruiting businesses and factories and commerce to the South as well. But white power was reasserted. We talked about redeeming. Some African Americans left instead and moved out to Kansas or to other places. They saw the writing on the wall, decided it was best to leave. And in Kansas, they were known as exodusters, and these were African American cowboys. Discrimination existed in Kansas as well, but there were generally more rights for African Americans there. There's a famous drawing of the abandonment of Reconstruction in the beginning of the Jim Crow era. There's a recruitment poster for African Americans that want to relocate to Kansas. And this brings us to election of 1876, which is going to be the nail in the coffin of Reconstruction. By this point, both parties want to end it. The Republicans choose Rutherford B. Hayes as their nominee. The Democrats choose Samuel Tilden. Tilden wins the popular vote by a 3-point margin. And he looks like he's going to win the Electoral College too, because 185 is the number of votes you need to win, and he has 184 with returns disputed in 3 states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. All Tilden needs to win is 1 electoral vote from one of these 3 states. But Hayes's guys go to the electors and say, hey, give your votes to Hayes, and Hayes promises he will remove the last federal troops from the South. And they agree to do it. And that's what happens. And thus Hayes ends up stealing the election. He wins the Electoral College, as you can see there, by 1 vote. And that's the end of Reconstruction. And it's the beginning in the 1880s of the Jim Crow era, which is going to be a long and difficult time for African Americans in the South. It's not going to end. Things aren't going to start making significant progress again until the 1950s. So, closing thoughts, as I said, history is not just a gradual progression of things getting better. Things get better, things get worse. Things only get better, though, if we make them get better. And that is the final thought I want to leave you with this time. What are you doing to make things better? I'm not saying this is a throwaway thing. I want you to actually think about that and do what you can to make the country better, because if you don't, it will get worse. And I will see you, hopefully, for the second half of the course, if you haven't already. You can also take, I teach political science classes. I teach Intro to Political Science and American Government. So if you're interested in politics, definitely take one or both of those. And if you ever need me in the future, by all means, shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'll be happy to help you out, write you a letter or whatever, or be a reference. But otherwise, have a good life. Bye-bye.